Thank you for coming to the first IC Radio Amplify of this year. First up, we have Imperial Climate Action. They're just going to be talking about, climate emergency and green on campus. So yeah, thank you.
I'm Oscar. I'm a computing undergrad at Imperial. I'm in my second year. I'm a member of ICA, Imperial Climate Action, and a couple of its sort of affiliated groups, which is plant-based unis, and Environmental Society and Imperial Plus, all these different groups working on climate action at Imperial. And I'm also Felix Environment Editor, which is our student newspaper here. And I'm joined today by Professor Waage. Jeff, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name's Jeff Waage. I'm an alumnus of Imperial College. Did my PhD here in the 1970s and taught here for about 10 years. Left for a while and came back, ran Department of Agriculture, which was then Center for Environmental Policy, and then moved on to other things. So I'm at the other end of the age group of Imperial Climate Action in the alumni group.
Let's start by just talking a little bit about what Imperial Climate Action is, what ICA is, and maybe how we both engage with that.
Well, I mean, I've had the pleasure of working with Imperial Climate Action the last couple of years. It is a group of committed scientists, students, academic staff, alumni like me, who are concerned about environmental issues, and as students and staff of Imperial College feel they have a particular role to play in this, partly because they're scientists, partly because they're working in an institution that's a leading institution with respect to climate change, whether that is working on climate change issues like the Grantham Institute, or actually working on research for future energy generation. And the interest that they have is to see change in the climate agenda through the work they do in Imperial College, and to address some of the problems.
Yeah, so you touched on, I guess, lots of different ways there that Imperial or people at Imperial do things that are deeply related to climate change, and we'll maybe get back to them in a second, but also just for me to explain, as a person who got interested in climate change probably well after you did, when my geography teacher introduced me to it in high school, with a podcast, in fact, and then has joined ICA as a way to continue some of the not super, radical way out there activism, but more of the engaging with members of staff, trying to make change happen through these more conventional means, alongside some of the more direct action stuff that ICA does. And I think that's one of the lovely things about what ICA is. It's a group of people who, as you say, are sort of similarly motivated, who will take action in all these different ways and be able to support each other doing so. And I think that's something you have a little bit of experience with as well, different kinds of activism where you see yourself in.
Yeah, so Oscar, I probably got into climate change when you did, because I was a typical academic having a career publishing papers, thinking, okay, I've published this paper, somebody's going to do something with it. It wasn't in climate change, but it was in sort of global issues. And I spent a lot of my career taking science evidence to policy. I was an advisor to the UN, to World Bank, and then, of course, the various government departments here in the UK. So I knew the science to policy process well. I was quite proud to be a scientist in that. But I didn't really begin looking at climate change until the last decade or so, when I began to realize as a scientist how severe the problem was. And I realized then that the policy process, which I'd been so familiar with, was not going to work fast enough to deal with the climate and ecological emergency we face, because it takes a very long time. It takes years. Governments change, politicians come and go, and commitments to policies are often not delivered. Look at the commitment we all made in 2015 to stay below 1.5 degrees global warming. That's gone. That's bust. We're heading towards 2 and 3 degrees, and there's no clear indication we're going to be able to stop before then. So the policy process isn't working. Of course, vested interests have had a big impact on that. The media, fossil fuel companies, those that are not part of the solution. So I got into this through not that long ago, when I decided towards the end of my formal career that I was going to try another approach. I felt that policy process didn't work, that the public were not aware, and that as a scientist, it was part of my job. So what I've been doing the last year or two, besides working with ICA, is working for an organization called Scientists for Extinction Rebellion, which provides the science support to that movement. And that's been a very interesting experience. But as Oscar says, it's a broad church. I don't get involved with gluing myself to many things these days, or getting arrested. Well, many of my colleagues do, but so much can be done about addressing climate change issues through conversations and through dialogues and through the policy within the university itself. And that's where I think ICA is particularly exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a great opportunity to talk about that. So as the Felix editor, I sort of pay quite close attention to the policy documents that come out of Imperial College and out of the union, but there's so much more that can be done on those things. So, recently we've had actually not so recently, we had the union endorsing our divestment campaign, which is great. So Camille, the union president, is really on board with that. And we've had the sustainability strategy from the college also saying that they want to be educating all of our graduates on sustainability by 2030 as part of their Class of 2030 initiative. And part of what ICA and also some of the union wants to work on is holding them to account for that kind of thing. That's part of our role as activists, is like keeping people to account for their existing commitments, which applies at a university and also so much at national levels and things, holding people to account for NDCs and this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think that's really impressive. The time I've spent with ICA, I've sat in front of the president of the college talking about sustainability agenda, which has been much of which has been taken up. I think that's a really important role that people, students and others can play here. And at the same time, reaching into departments and reaching into teaching programs. I think I've got a personal view after many years that not only do we all need to know about climate change as scientists, but I think we have a particular responsibility because now, not everybody in Imperial College is a climate scientist, but many of them are scientists, whether they're mathematicians or microbiologists, or work in environmental sciences. One thing they all know is enough science to understand climate change. And in a world where communication is being blocked through problems of vested interests, through a media that is often uninterested in or even suppressing climate change information, reaching the public is important. And we have skills that we learned as scientists, privileged skills. I was just thinking this morning, got a colleague of mine in Extinction Rebellion is working on the floods recently in Wales, and if you hear the sentence, the floods in Wales were 50% more likely because of climate change. I think every scientist in Imperial College, whether they're microbiologists, others, can get their head around that. So they know a bit about statistics, a bit about probability, they know what modeling is. But for the public, that's something that a lot of people don't know. And one of the things I think my colleagues in ICA do in the process of their work is they learn to communicate science to administrators, like the administration of Imperial College, to people in a rally, to people in a protest, to the public. And I think that's an incredible skill that our scientists should have today. All scientists should have. All should, and the training programs that ICA has also helped to support and advocate are important. So that's why I think one of the really good reasons to belong is that it prepares you for being a good communicator in a world that's going to inevitably become far more interested in climate change as the crisis progresses.
Yeah, it's an absolutely classic thing that happens to scientists as you go through your degree and past that you become extremely good at communicating with other people who know about as much as you about the thing that you're working on. And there isn't a huge amount of effort put into working on communicating to most people about that kind of topic, however important it is. And I do think, as you say, that's one of the really useful things about ICA is that we're working on that kind of thing, and about activism in general, which is working on, making the public more aware of these issues, making sure that they're talking about them. And so much of that is not just the immediate sharing of facts, and it has to be grounded in that, but it's also the storytelling of what is the problem, how do we, feel about the problem, if that makes sense. And yeah, as you say, ICA really relevant to that.
Yeah, a lot of it is, if you get involved in this issue, I've found, and most of my colleagues in Extinction Rebellion, Scientists for Extinction Rebellion, and ICA are far younger than I am. You find you're in a rather lonely position because it's a really big problem, climate change. As in trying to do something about it, you often find yourself challenged, even by your own families or your friends. You find it a hard argument to keep pushing at. And to be in a community of people facing the same challenge, I think is really important. I get a tremendous a lot of support out of that, even at my stage. And I also appreciate that many young scientists, this is going to be your problem much more than it is mine. Nicholas Stern said the best way to avoid climate change is to be over 60. And if this is going to be very much your problem, it's very good to explore and develop it with the support of others. I think one of the problems that young scientists have is that there's a lot of worry that getting involved in more public or activist activities might influence your career, might influence your promotion, your movement. And I know in the college I work in now, London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, it's something we talk quite a lot about. In fact, there's a movement there to say, okay, part of an academic's role is citizenship, is contributing to sit on committees, but also to communicate with the public. And that's an argument that's going through there. Do we as students and as scientists in academia have a role to engage with the public about key issues? Is that something we're rewarded for rather than punished for? So I think there's a lot of dynamism there. I think ICA's got a particularly important opportunity to build that idea into life at Imperial College, that activism in its broadest sense, communication of problems, but also the various ways in which they can be brought to public attention might be important for all of us as scientists, and should be part of the agenda in a university.
Yeah, absolutely. And so science is one of these things that plays a role in keeping the whole of a country functioning, in terms of keeping it sort of straight on the facts, in the same way that journalism plays part of that role and governments play part of that role. And so having activists there is really important when, as you say, media becomes increasingly polarized and unfriendly to maybe some of those facts. But should we get a little bit into some of what ICA specifically is doing as well at Imperial, some of our existing campaigns? I think there's lots of exciting stuff happening, and I think it's one of the nice things that ICA can offer is just it's a space where, as we say, you can come and bring, I have this idea, I want to do this, and there'll be some support from you there. We had our education campaign, which spun off into its own organization, Imperial Plus, running last year, and that's hopefully making really significant progress. And then we have another campaign which ICA is working on, which is related to some of these partnerships which they have with fossil fuel companies. So Imperial has a socially responsible investment policy, which is the policy that sets out who they will invest in, and it sets some rules for sort of the ethics of that. And there's also sort of adjacent to that is who Imperial takes partnerships with to do research. And the growing body of research about that at the moment, sort of the meta research about research, is that just by not talking about these connections that universities have with fossil fuel companies and how that might bias their outcomes, it sort of leads to biased outcomes just because we're not talking about it enough. And I think that's a little important bit of work that ICA is doing there as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know I guess for 2 years ago, you might have seen in Felix a bit of a dialogue about the Science Museum. It was a dialogue led by ICA. I was involved in that because it's one of my roles in Scientists for Extinction Rebellion. I'm helping to lead a campaign to encourage the Science Museum to stop its sponsorship from fossil fuel industries. Not all fossil fuel industries, but simply the fossil fuel industries that are ignoring international demand for the immediate reduction in fossil fuel extraction development. We've got a lot of fossil fuels around. We don't need to start a lot of new oil wells. And some of those industries are now the major sponsors of our science museum. Quite a few of us feel that's not right. And three of the trustees who support that decision are Imperial College professors. So so we set up a very nice dialogue, both sides of the issue in Felix. Some of us in ICA presented the case against. We invited those trustees and the staff of Imperial College to provide the case for. And I thought that was sort of one of the nice sort of achievements that ICA has done. It was a balanced discussion. I think we won, but the Science Museum is still getting very large amounts of money from a major coal producer in the world, who's opening new coal mines everywhere. So so there's still a battle to be won. But I think that's an example of where, a really good and focused debate can occur about the fossil fuel industry and the role which organizations like the Science Museum or universities should have in interacting with it. And I think that's a real challenge for people here at Imperial College, and I think it's a really exciting thing to do as a student and as an academic in the course of your career.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, it is a thing where Imperial is known for its industry connections, right? It's one of the biggest selling points of it. Certainly, one of the biggest selling points of my degree, computing, is the industrial connections that has, and they like that. And so it's not something, and it has to become that kind of dialogue that you started in Felix, where at least you're talking about what the impact of those is, because I'm sure the Science Museum would say, if we can still talk about climate change and we can still do this stuff relating to climate change as part of the Science Museum, and these companies want to give us money, then what's the problem, right? And it's just beginning that conversation is really crucial.
Yeah. I mean, it's a complicated issue, and Imperial College, the Grantham Institute's been very much involved in developing what they call the Transition Pathways Initiative, which is basically a way in which companies can show the extent to which they're committed to phasing out fossil fuels, and then organizations like universities or a museum down the road can say, we will only be funded by people who are companies who are going to stick to these targets that are internationally agreed. So there's a lot of opportunity there in that regard. One of the things that occurs to me about the Imperial College situation is that Imperial College is producing a lot of tomorrow's top scientists in the area of energy. To what extent should it be looking to where that training should be directed? I wouldn't say the fossil fuel industry is on its way out quickly, but even at COP29, again, it's been more or less confirmed by governments that we're going to wind it down. We're going to wind down fossil fuels. The problem is we're not winding it down fast enough to prevent environmental catastrophe, but it is being wound down. So Imperial College, as with a tremendous history in the engineering around that industry, what should it be doing in its policy about how it develops its departments and its program? That's a question. I don't have an answer to it, or possibly even an opinion about it, but it's an interesting one. There's tremendous work in Imperial on renewable energies and other areas. Should they be just focusing on that? Should they be accepting money from big fossil fuel companies that might be doing a bit of green energy as a bit of greenwashing? Or should they be being very specific and discreet about what kind of industrial funding they accept for research and in what direction of research? And those are all rather big issues, I think, and I'm not proposing a solution to that, but I think it's another thing that Imperial Climate Action is interested in exploring within this university.
Well, part of it is from the student's perspective of, well, I don't want to be educated for a career that's not going to exist in even particularly much. I would prefer to have, applicable skills in 30 years' time, right? When many of these fossil fuel phase out commitments are really going to be taking place. And a lot of the, skills that you train in industry for the fossil fuel, for oil and gas, are relevant to other sectors. And there's a, demand for those kinds of skills, but some of them are not. And I would hope that Imperial, as a place that is producing world-leading research, would be teaching me stuff that is relevant for the future that I'm going to be living in.
Yeah. I wonder if this is a good time to ask if there are any comments from the audience or questions about ICA.
You mentioned the term greenwashing. I was wondering if you could define that for me.
So greenwashing is a term that has been, particularly with respect to industries, industries will initiate a small amount of environmentally directed activities and promote them as important, while conducting activities which are environmentally damaging. And so they're basically putting enough effort in to make a billboard saying that they're changing. Now, if you go to Heathrow Airport, or if you go just about anywhere in international travel, you will see fossil fuel industries saying, we're exploring wind generation, we're exploring alternative technologies, we're at the forefront of this, we have the people, we have the science, we're doing this. But then if you look behind that, and I'm thinking of, I guess I shouldn't mention companies on on the radio, but actually there's a lot of evidence here, BP or Shell. They are investing in a bit of wind and other energies, but it is less than 5% of their total new investment. And yet it is all you see on the billboards. And that's greenwashing. And from a point of view of the sort of program that we're involved in with Science Museum, it's a good example. Adani Energy, the coal organization that is funding the Science Museum, and produced an exhibit on the future of energy. They have been given, by being allowed to put a green energy exhibit in to the museum, they've basically been able to greenwash their reputation, which is truthfully one of the world's largest coal industries, creating problems for the future. They've been given the social license, one might say, by the Science Museum to present a different image of themselves. And that's what greenwashing is.
Yeah. And I'll just add to that briefly. There are so many examples of greenwashing, that some of which are really excellent, some of which I find quite amusing. But I think it ties in nicely to some other justice issues that I think ICA also considers itself connected to. So greenwashing is not just covering up your bad environmental impact with good environmental things that you're doing, however small they are. It is also covering up any other kinds of negative impacts that you're having by showing your positive environmental impact. And it's important that as climate activists, we don't shy away from those issues where, I don't know, a country has gone to war but wants to talk about how great they are for planting trees, right? These are, or where they have human rights issues for other reasons, and they are proclaiming their green credentials on that front. And so this is one of the nice things where ICA can relate to the other things that like the other liberation and community officers at the union are doing, and also just the other societies at Imperial are doing. And it's a really nice, and I think really important issue that we ensure that climate justice is all these other kinds of justice, and greenwashing is not just about the environment. Yeah.
So related to that, how do you differentiate a company greenwashing from a company that's actually trying to have a palpable impact or shifts their policy towards something more renewable or sustainable? Because I guess if a company is starting to take steps towards having more sustainable policy, how do you differentiate that from people like trying to greenwash? And then if you kind of maybe reprimand them and kind of negatively talk about them, I guess, like how do you know they're not trying to kind of slowly shift towards more green and then you discourage them? I don't know if that's ever actually happens, but is there a way to tell, or have you guys ever seen a case where a company, I don't know?
Yeah. People write reports about this. Scientists do reports on these different companies. There's a report that gets released, I think annually. It's I don't remember the name of it. There's like a report on, for example, summarizing all of the big oil companies' climate commitments, for example, and they grade them on all these different metrics, and they give them little like red, amber, green indicators and stuff like that. And people do that for nations, people do that for all different kinds of companies. And this is the kind of way maybe that you would want to look at for, are the commitments in line genuinely with what we would need for something like 1.5 degrees or for 2 degrees, whatever your threshold is. And then you can decide based on that, is this thing that they're doing greenwashing? Are they spending 10 times as much on marketing as they are on actually doing the initiative? And I think you can get to an answer which I think has some validity, right? It's not just we always are asking for more, although that's part of our job as activists, I think, as well.
Yeah, it's a tricky issue for scientists because even if you're dealing with a major fossil fuel company, if it is exploring an area of innovative energy sourcing, and your research on that, funded by that organization, leads to some positive futures, alternative energies, then how important is it, or how bad was it that the funding came from that direction? So there's an element of, as Oscar says, there's an element of actually looking at what the company's actually doing compared to what they're saying and what they're investing in. But there's also the element of personal decision as a scientist, as a researcher, what am I going to do here? I'm getting money from this organization, this industry. Can I work in that to do good, or am I going to be drawn into the greenwashing world? And a big poster of me at Heathrow Airport saying, our young scientists are breaking through the barriers to a green future. So that's one good reason to actually talk to other scientists about this. That's one thing that I think happens in ICA is you face those issues and you have to discuss them a bit. So yeah, interesting problem. Yeah.
Any more questions? Or yeah, perfect. Thank you guys so much.